It is September 1939. German democracy is long dead, war has broken out, and in only 6 years this will mean an unprecedented destruction of the global economy, immeasurable suffering, and the death of over 70 million people, 17 of whom will be directly murdered by the Nazis. Those are the immediate consequences of, among other things, the death of democracy in Germany from 1933 to 1939. But in the end, in 1945, there will be a time of reckoning, a time to look ahead and rebuild better than before, based on the lessons learned from these years of tragedy. In 2026, we live the luxury of benefiting from the work of the war and post-war generations who did exactly that. We're also collectively forgetting, or not fully understanding, their incredible contribution to humanity and reviving the mistakes they tried to warn us away from. Tonight, we will remind ourselves of the work to rebuild German and European democracy and peace that followed Nazi Germany's defeat and, despite the challenges we continue to face, how it has created a better world. I'm Spartacus Olsen, and welcome to the final episode, the standalone, independently viewable epilogue to the Death of Democracy series. Okay, in many episodes in our post-war coverage here on this channel and the Time Goes channel, we've seen the lessons from World War II that led to the continuation of the United Nations as the peacetime successor to the wartime alliance, the formulation and adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, the failed denazification project in West Germany that was finally remedied by the post-war generations in the 1960s and 70s, leading to an unprecedented culture of remembrance and responsibility in Germany to this day. We've examined the basis to rebuild a functional, prosperous world in the West and the continued autocratic tyranny under Soviet rule in Eastern Europe. Today, I will instead focus on the specific post-war efforts to avoid the disasters of the episodes of this series and how Western Europe came together to prevent another Nazi Germany from rising and launching another war. We will look to Germany itself, but also to Europe as a whole. For brevity, we will skip over the East-West conflict in the Cold War and the end of communist hegemony in 1991, that too played a part in creating the democratic structures of present Europe, but that is another story, perhaps an entire series of its own. Okay, so as we have seen over 27 episodes, German democracy was effectively destroyed in only 60 days in 1933, and then the following 6 years revealed with chilling clarity how dictatorship could entrench itself when emergency powers, parliamentary intimidation, Gleichschaltung, political policing, press control, and the destruction of independent institutions all reinforced one another. The rapid consolidation of power exposed just how fragile democracy could be when its safeguards were methodically dismantled. Then came the war, and when it ended, Germany was divided into East and West. In the East, another anti-democratic authoritarian ideology took hold under Soviet occupation. In the West, the Allies debated how to reform their part of Germany into a more stable democracy. To that, the architects of the German Federal Republic responded by creating the 1949 Grundgesetz, a fundamental law, conceived as a defensive democracy. Democratic power was to be not only restored, but meticulously limited, divided, and constitutionally restrained from ever abolishing itself again. It demanded that human dignity and rights must precede state powers. Democracy cannot be legally abolished. Parliament has to dominate the executive, not a presidential strongman. Pluralism has to be stable, but democracy need not tolerate its own destruction. The Constitution requires an independent guardian. Power has to be geographically dispersed. A free public sphere has to remain outside government control. Democracy also requires social legitimacy. The intended result was that no president, party, parliamentary majority, emergency decree, or captured ministry could alone recreate the tragedy of 1933. Any authoritarian movement would have to overcome a web of independent institutions, enforceable rights, and an unamendable constitutional core. Yet the deeper lesson remained that constitutional design could only make dictatorship harder, not impossible. Democracy, in the end, always depends on judges, officials, parties, journalists, and citizens willing to defend it, and on their shared resolve never to let history repeat itself. But the Grundgesetz was not only based on lessons from the Nazi seizure of power, but also the product of a much broader experiment, drawing on 2 centuries of democratic constitutional experience, selecting what had worked, rejecting what had failed, and combining the results into something new. The process began on the 1st of July 1948 when the American, British, and French military governors presented the West German minister-presidents with the Frankfurt Documents. They required a democratic constitution that would guarantee individual rights, protect the Länder, the German states, create an effective central authority, and establish a federal state. German constitutional experts then prepared the Herrenchiemsee draft, which the Parliamentary Council in Bonn revised between September 1948 and May 1949. The Allies imposed the outer framework and retained approval rights, but the detailed architecture was overwhelmingly the work of German politicians and jurists. The American Constitution provided one important foundation, a written law superior to ordinary legislation, the vertical division of power through federalism, institutional checks and balances, entrenched rights, and judicial enforcement of constitutional limits. But Bonn did not copy the American presidential system. Instead, it combined American constitutional supremacy with British parliamentary government, German federal traditions, French ideas of universal rights, the democratic legacy of the 1849 Frankfurt Constitution, the Weimar Constitution, and the post-war constitutions of the Länder. Its specialized constitutional court drew mostly directly from the Austrian model developed by Hans Kelsen, although American and Swiss models of a supreme federal court were also considered. The resulting improvements are evident in the combination and difference from the other models. First, the American Constitution begins by constructing government. The Grundgesetz begins by limiting it. Human dignity comes first, followed by rights that explicitly bind the legislature, executive, and judiciary as directly applicable law. Parliament itself is therefore subordinate to the Constitution, contrary to the British doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty. Second, constitutional review was made explicit and concentrated in a powerful federal constitutional court. Now, American judicial review developed through precedent and may be exercised by ordinary courts. Germany created a dedicated guardian, empowered to review laws, settle disputes between constitutional institutions, police federal boundaries, and protect the constitutional order. But the way the court was appointed saw some improvements to the U.S. system, where the president nominates Supreme Court justices and a Senate majority confirms them. Germany divides appointments equally between the Bundestag and Bundesrat and requires a 2/3 majority. This forces cross-party and federal consensus, while non-renewable 12-year terms reduce partisan court packing through life appointments. Third, the framers created a flexible exterior with an indestructible core. The Grundgesetz can be amended by 2/3 majorities in the Bundestag and Bundesrat, less onerous than the American process, but Article 79 permanently protects human dignity, democracy, federalism, the social state, and the rule of law. The American Constitution entrenches equal state representation in the Senate, but contains no comparable catalog of unamendable democratic and human rights principles. Constitutional guarantees for press, speech, religion, association, assembly, scholarship, and the arts were enshrined as explicit protections, not only to foster debate and dissent, but to ensure no propaganda monopoly or government could once again silence independent voices or destroy the fabric of civic life. Fourth, Germany rejected both an American-style president with an independent electoral mandate and Weimar's powerful Reich president. The chancellor depends on the Bundestag and can be removed only when Parliament simultaneously elects a successor, through a constructive vote of no confidence. The government can therefore be replaced without leaving a vacuum, whereas the president cannot develop into a rival center of political power. Fifth, German federalism was made cooperative rather than simply competitive. In other words, it retained states' rights, but meshed them more closely with the federal legislative and governmental structure. The Bundesrat represents the governments of the Länder, not a second set of nationally elected politicians. The states therefore participate directly in federal legislation and administer much federal law themselves. Finally, the Grundgesetz went beyond the classical liberal state. It defined Germany as a democratic and social federal state, recognizing that political liberty requires some measure of social security. Economic collapse, unemployment, and insecurity had previously helped extremists undermine confidence in parliamentary government. To support this, the Federal Republic developed the social market model. Democratic freedom was to rest on a foundation of economic security, not to be left vulnerable to mass desperation and promises of authoritarian salvation. It also opened the country to international law and supranational institutions and constitutionally rejected preparations for aggressive war. These were lessons drawn not merely from Hitler's dictatorship, but from industrial inequality, the Great Depression, militant nationalism, 2 world wars, and the collapse of collective security. The Grundgesetz was therefore a deliberate hybrid of what was judged as the best part of several other models: American constitutional supremacy, British parliamentary responsibility, Austrian constitutional justice, German federalism, European social constitutionalism, and universal human rights, assembled into a state in which no president, parliament, court, government, or majority was meant to hold the whole machinery of power alone. But in the democratic West, the Second World War taught that Europe, not only Germany, required a new constitutional order. Democracy could not remain safe while sovereign states weaponized industry, nationalism, and military power. It revived an idea that had been on the table several times since Abbot Charles de Saint-Pierre's 1713 suggestion for a European perpetual union with a common treasury and open borders, and Immanuel Kant's 1795 theoretical proposal of an international congress of states to secure permanent peaceful relations. In 1945, the most recent ideas in this direction were John Maynard Keynes' 1920 Customs Union, Richard von Coudenhove-Kalergi's 1923 Pan-European Union, and French Prime Minister Aristide Briand's 1930 formal proposal of a federal European interstate union to assuage the effects of the Great Depression and halt the slide towards authoritarian left and right-wing ideologies that he correctly predicted would otherwise lead to war on the continent. The starting shot for this new European project is often considered Winston Churchill's speech at Zurich University in 1946. Referencing the previous attempts at unification and the United States democratic traditions, he said, "The first step in the recreation of the European family must be a partnership between France and Germany. In this way only can France recover the moral and cultural leadership of Europe. There can be no revival of Europe without a spiritually great France and a spiritually great Germany. The structure of the United States of Europe, if well and truly built, will be such as to make the material strength of a single state less important. Small nations will count as much as large ones and gain their honor by their contribution to the common cause. The ancient states and principalities of Germany, freely joined together for mutual convenience in a federal system, might take their individual places among the United States of Europe." 4 years later, the Schuman Plan offered a practical answer: reconcile France and West Germany as equals, integrate rather than punish the former aggressor, place coal and steel, the sinews of modern war, under common authority, and make another Franco-German conflict materially difficult. The integration that followed in the decades thereafter absorbed principles from the Grundgesetz, the French and Italian post-war constitutions, the European Convention on Human Rights, and other traditions: human dignity before state convenience, government beneath law, enforceable rights, independent courts, and divided power, preventing institutional capture. The Charter of Fundamental Rights gathered civil, political, economic, and social protections into a European catalogue. But Europe was not a nation-state and could not copy Bonn, Paris, or Washington. It was stronger than the League of Nations, but short of a centralized state. And yet, With all those bells, whistles, and issues attached, the European Union was founded in 1993 as a supranational union sui generis, a union of nations in and of itself. It was a union only by the voluntary membership of the member states. It was not rigidly created by a constitutional structure, but streamlined the constitutional and legal structure of the members based on a minimum of constitutionality in accordance with the European Charter, democratic foundational principles, human rights, and the four freedoms of the European Union: the free movement of goods, capital, services, and people across the borders of the member states. By 2001, it was an effective structure, but the tangled treaties burdened the Union, preparing to admit Central and Eastern European democracies. The Laeken Declaration asked how Europe itself could become more democratic, transparent, efficient, and comprehensible, how powers should be divided, how national parliaments could restrain overreach, whether the charter should become binding, and whether the treaties should be gathered into a constitution. What came out of that was the 2004 Constitutional Treaty, which placed peace, dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, minority rights, and the rule of law at the Union's foundation. Through parliamentary legislation, an independent commission, and judicial enforcement, it tried to avoid both domination by one state and the paralysis of a weak international league. But French and Dutch voters rejected it in 2005 for domestic, economic, and Eurosceptic reasons. To salvage the proposal's goals of integration and stability, a 2007 compromise abandoned the constitutional name, symbols, and state-like language. Yet most of the machinery survived in the Lisbon Treaty, signed on December 2007 and effective on December 1, 2009. It is a treaty-based constitutional order, built to bind states through law, restrain power, protect rights, and make peace durable for generations on a continent still haunted by total war, while acknowledging that Europe still has no single sovereign people empowered to constitute one federal state. While Eurosceptics see it as a burden and erosion of sovereignty, its true nature and purpose is the preservation of democracy, freedom, prosperity, and peace for the battered peoples of a continent perpetually destroyed and rebuilt by wars for centuries. As you have just seen, that is not my opinion or anyone's, but the explicit and publicly stated goal of both the Lisbon Treaty and the European Union itself. It is a continental attempt to institutionalize and cement the learnings of how we can avoid the tragic apocalypse of World War II. It is the more peaceful, benign child of belligerent parents that has learned the dangers of authoritarianism, especially the danger one of its ancestors, Nazi Germany, posed to the world. But what about the lasting effects of the remedies to avoid another collapse of democracy in Germany itself? Well, in 2026, the Federal Republic remains among the stronger democracies on Earth. Not immaculate, not invulnerable, but far from the constitutional corpse we witnessed after 1933. Across surveys of democracy, freedom, law, corruption, and press liberty, Germany sits within the world's highest 5 to 10% and in the upper tier of the European Union, though usually behind the Nordic democracies. Its great strength is the machinery built from the ruins of Weimar: competitive elections, an independent judiciary, federalism, enforceable rights, and a constitutional court capable of checking government power. Corruption is limited. Political opposition can replace those in office, and the press remains free to expose wrongdoing. The democratic fortifications designed in 1949 are standing. But outside those walls, warning lights are burning. Journalists face more threats and attacks, protest rights and civic space have narrowed, digital privacy remains vulnerable to state surveillance, lobbying, party finance, and political influence are too opaque, minority protections are strong by global standards, but progress has slowed, and parts of civil society are treated as problems to be managed rather than as voices to be heard. My verdict is therefore an A-, about 8.5 out of 10. Germany is not sliding into systemic dictatorship. Its institutions remain resilient, and its democracy is healthier than the global norm. But democracy rarely dies first in constitutions. It weakens in habits. When restrictions become normal, scrutiny becomes inconvenient, and citizens learn to accept less freedom because the machinery of state still appears orderly. So that is Germany. What about some of the people we met during this series? We know what happened to the Nazi leadership. It deservedly didn't end well for them. Few survived the war, in many cases by suicide and cowardice to accept the consequences of their actions. Those who did survive soon faced justice and often the hangman's noose. U.S. pre-war and wartime correspondent William Shirer went on to pursue a successful career in journalism and drew on his deep insight into Nazi Germany in his foundational epic, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, which I may have quoted once or twice in this series. To World War historians, including me, he remains a great inspiration, even as we have learned more over the decades and some of his conclusions have been revised by increased understanding and newly discovered facts. Nationalist Hamburg diarist Luise Solmetz survived the war with her husband Fredi and her daughter Gisela. She returned to teaching and continued her diary until her death in 1973, leaving 65 volumes to researchers. Fredi was forced into compulsory labor in 1943 and only survived through the limited protection of his mixed marriage. He died of natural causes in 1961. Their daughter Gisela saw her youth and dreams of higher education robbed by the Nazis. She eventually married a Belgian, settled abroad, and died in France in 2009 at the age of 89. Jewish Dresden diarist Victor Klemperer. The bombing of Dresden disrupted his impending deportation and allowed him to escape. After 1945, he resumed his academic career, joined East Germany's communist establishment, and died in 1960. Jewish Berlin physician Herta Natov. She escaped through Britain to New York in 1940, but unable to resume practicing medicine and with the trauma of the years under Nazism left her suffering, she at one point attempted suicide. Finally, she found peace in her work in social welfare and psychotherapy and died of natural causes in 1993. Nazi supporting anatomy professor Hermann Voss. When the war came and the Holocaust began, he became one of the perpetrators of immoral, unethical studies on victims' remains. At the Reich University of Posen, he exploited the bodies of executed Poles and Jews for anatomical work and commercial specimens. After 1945, he resumed a prominent academic career in East Germany and died in 1987. American ambassador's daughter, Mata Dodd. She actually became a Soviet secret agent, fled an American espionage investigation in 1956, and spent much of her later life in Czechoslovakia and Cuba. She died in Prague in 1990. Persecuted Breslau diarist Walter Tausk. He was deported from Breslau to Kaunas on the 25th of November 1941 and murdered there. Czech journalist and resistor Milena Jesenska, arrested by the Gestapo in November 1939 for resistance work, she was eventually sent to Ravensbrück, where she died on 17th of May 1944. Conservative anti-Nazi diarist Friedrich Reck Malechewin. Arrested late in 1944, he was sent to Dachau and died there in February 1945. Whether from typhus or execution remains disputed. Young anti-Nazi observer Sebastian Haffner. He spent the war in Britain as a prominent anti-Nazi commentator, returned to West Germany in 1954, and became a leading journalist and historian. He died in 1999. In my early days of trying to understand Nazism and Hitler, his writings were invaluable to my education. American teacher and dissident Mildred Fish-Hanak. Arrested for resistance activities in 1942 and condemned to prison, she was retried on Hitler's orders and beheaded at Plötzensee prison on 16th of February 1943. Persecuted expressionist painter Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. He did not live to see 1939. Amid the Nazi confiscation and vilification of his work, he died by suicide near Davos on 15th of June 1938. Austrian Jewish diarist Ruth Meyer. She fled to Norway in 1939, but was arrested on 26 of November 1942, deported aboard the Donau, and murdered at Auschwitz on 1st of December 1942. It is in there, and all others who suffered through this time memory, that I do what I do. Not just those who were the victims and heroes, but also the perpetrators, the villains, and the monsters. Because when I say never forget at the end of an episode, I'm not asking you to simply mourn the fallen, but remember where our humanity can lead us, both for the better and the worse. We might wish we were on the good side of things if we had lived in these times, but that is only wishful thinking, because we are who we are in great part only in relation to the times and zeitgeist that we live in. And yet, we are also who we want to be, what we aspire to, bound to the moral, ethical framework we choose to follow. Today in 2026, as the specters of the 1930s rise again, this is more essential than ever. We can defeat the ghosts of yesterday because we have done it before. Better yet, we can avoid following them. We can fight them preemptively and stop their wailing from tempting humanity to descend into darkness again. But we can only do that if we recognize them, name them, call them out, and stand fast in the belief in our better spirits, tolerance, respect, dignity, and human rights. Never forget. I have not yet decided what my next big series will be. I'm happy to hear your suggestions in the comments. We will make 3 or 4 long-form videos to abridge this series in the autumn. While I work on that and search my soul for the next thing, I will work with our very own Tom Aldis to produce more videos on the hardware and processes of German rearmament. I'm also in the final stages of creating a World War II trivia game. Here's the board and some mock-ups that I will be releasing for pre-order very shortly. It's an educational game that anyone who is fascinated by this conflict and its origins should not miss, and it's going to be really fun. The way I've constructed it, it will be playable at the appropriate level for novices, aficionados, and experts alike, even against each other at even handicap. More about that in separate announcements. Once again, thank you to our entire team, and especially the Time Ghost Army, who are the only ones who allow us to do what we do. Join us on timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Good night, and good luck.